Good evening and welcome to Skullnet 7. My name is Patryk Witkowski and I'm joined today by William Duguid, who works for the Perfin Kinross Yes campaign and is also a writer. Hello.
Hello, good to see you again, Patrick.
Nice to see you too. For our first story, we have the Ukraine update, day 749 of conflict. The Pentagon will rush about $300 million in weapons to Ukraine after finding cost savings in its contracts, the White House has announced. As efforts to get new U.S. funds for weapons remained stalled in the House of Representatives, House Democrats are gathering signatures for a discharge petition, which can circumvent the Speaker, Mike Johnson, who's preventing the House from considering the $95 billion package of aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Poland's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, warned Mike Johnson on Tuesday that the fate of millions of people and thousands of lives depend on whether Johnson allows the vote. Ukraine launched drone attacks on several Russian regions for the second night in a row, officials said on Wednesday. A gas supply line was hit, cutting off power to some villages in the Belgorod region, says the governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov. Roman Starovoit, governor of Kursk Oblast, north of Belgorod, said air defense systems targeted 4 Ukraine-launched drones. Over Monday night and Tuesday morning, Ukraine targeted Russian energy facilities in one of its largest cross-border drone and rocket attacks of the war. One attack hit an oil refinery in the Nizhny Novgorod region and produced nearly 6% of that produces nearly 60% of Russia's total refined crude oil. Another hit on an oil depot in the city of Oriol. The attacks on Tuesday came as three pro-Ukrainian battalions made up of recruits from Russia launched an incursion in the Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk regions in a rare raid meant to bring the 2-year-old war to Russian soil, if only for a short time. Videos showed the troops overrunning Russian border checkpoints and pitched fighting in settlements. A Russian missile hit 2 apartment buildings in the central Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih on Tuesday, killing 3 people and injuring at least 38, including 10 children. 10 EU countries are close to a deal on military aid fund for Ukraine that would pave the way for an injection of €5 billion, diplomats have said. French lawmakers have backed a security accord with Ukraine. The 10-year security pact with Ukraine includes commitments by Paris to deliver more arms, train soldiers, and send up to €3 billion in military aid. Denmark will provide a new military aid package, including Caesar artillery systems and ammunition to Ukraine, worth about 2.3 billion Danish crowns. A Russian Tu-76 military transport plane crashed in the Ivanovo region northeast of Moscow on Tuesday, with 15 people on board, according to the Interfax news agency. The Ukrainian Security Service said it had uncovered one of the largest networks in the country, allegedly spreading pro-Russian information sabotage, coordinated by a cleric of a minority Moscow-linked Ukrainian Orthodox Church. William, passing over to you, what do you think of the developments in the Ukraine war as reported now?
It's a typically sort of confused, messy situation with plus points here for Ukraine and perhaps plus points for Russia in other places. We still, after several weeks, seems to be talking about funding the war effort in Ukraine. The EU seems to be getting closer to a package that will give some assistance. Um, Whereas in the US, with a really quite complicated package involving several different things, including, of course, the Gaza conflict, which has been the thing that really has diverted attention away from Ukraine a bit, with that seemingly stalling because of Mike Johnson and apparent need to circumvent him. So a lot will be to do with how that pans out and whether that aid can actually be released. Meanwhile, we're seeing saber rattling from spokespeople in Russia. about the conflict spinning out of control because of what NATO are doing, which is actually not as much as it could be at the moment, I think, and also the massing of troops on the Finnish border as a result of Finland joining NATO. So, as always in war, you can't sort of steer a path through it, and a lot will be clearer in hindsight than in the actual course of events. But it's still a pretty critical stage, and I think at some point the rest of the war will become a bit clearer, but not just yet.
Thank you. Moving on to our Israel and Gaza latest. 88 Palestinians were killed and 135 injured in Israeli strikes in the past 24 hours, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. The statement said that at least 31,272 Palestinians have been killed and 73,024 have been injured in Israeli strikes on Gaza since the 7th of October. Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, said on Tuesday that the number of children reported killed in just over 4 months in Gaza is higher than the number of children killed in 4 years of wars around the world combined. The aid ship of Spanish-flagged Open Arms, which left Cyprus yesterday, is expected to reach Gaza's shores tomorrow morning, about 48 hours after it departed Larnaca. The vessel is towing a barge with up to 200 tons of water, food, and vital medicines. The government in Gaza said today that sending an aid ship from Cyprus to the besieged territory was an inadequate response to the needs of its 2.4 million people. The UK should join the EU in considering whether to suspend its trade agreements with Israel in light of breaches of humanitarian law. A group of human rights NGOs, including Amnesty International UK, Global Justice Now, and Action Aid UK, urged today. Violent clashes overnight have left multiple Palestinians dead in the West Bank. Official Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that Israeli forces killed 2 Palestinians during a raid in the occupied West Bank earlier the same day, bringing to 5 the number of Palestinians killed in different incidents within several hours. Israeli forces shot dead a 13-year-old Palestinian from a refugee camp on the outskirts of Jerusalem on Tuesday night and killed 2 others at a checkpoint, Israeli police said. EU Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell criticized the lack of aid entering Gaza as a man-made disaster on Tuesday, telling the UN Security Council that hunger was being used as a war arm. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, said one of its aid warehouses in the Gaza Strip was hit today, injuring scores, quote, of people. 4 U.S. Army vessels departed a base in Virginia on Tuesday, carrying about 100 soldiers and equipment needed to build a temporary port on Gaza's coast to facilitate aid shipments. The World Food Programme, WFP, said on Tuesday that it had delivered its first successful aid convoy to northern Gaza since the 20th of February. The Israeli army on Tuesday night announced a pilot project for delivering aid directly into the north, saying 6 WFP aid trucks had entered through a new crossing. The WFP did not specifically mention the new overland route on its post on X about Tuesday's delivery. Turkey views the airdrop of humanitarian aid to Gaza and the plan to deliver aid via a maritime route as positive developments, but thinks they fall short of resolving the core problem. The father of Itai Chen, an Israeli soldier killed during the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, has called for a hostage deal to ensure his son's body is returned home. A Palestinian citizen of Israel has been granted UK asylum in a case said to be unprecedented before. William, I'll let you give an overall statement on what you think of the developments in Israel, but first I kind of wanted you to sort of comment on how effective and also whether you would argue for these sort of airdropped care packages. Do you see this as like an efficient and a good way of getting aid into Gaza?
I think it's generally recognised that airdrops are not a particularly efficient way of getting aid in. They're ineffective, really, compared to what could be happening by road or by sea, but they are, of course, in certain points, the only option. So ineffective and costly, but sadly necessary at this point. We really need to get sorted out how aid can properly get into Palestine, and particularly Gaza, at the moment, because it's proving fiendishly difficult, as I shall go on to elaborate when I do make my statement. But I hope that answers your question about airdrops.
Yes, no, thank you. You can
Right.
continue with your general statement.
Well, okay. Um, it was. I was glad to hear you talk about the ongoing um, military campaign against Gaza, which isn't the full scale thing, but is still there are casualties going on there, because that's sometimes obscured in the light of the larger issue of getting aid in. And I was also glad to hear you mention that there's still ongoing harassment of Palestinians in the West Bank. That, of course, is something that has been going on since, well, I would say time immemorial, but let's say for much of the last 75 years. But it has got worse, and particular hotspots such as Jenin are really troublesome for the Palestinian community there. At Commonweal Perth and Kinross, we've got a guy there in Jenin who came to speak to us, Yusuf Awad, some years ago. And we are in touch with him, hearing about the situation there. And that is really quite something. So this is all going on while we have the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, which is getting worse slowly at the minute, but could tip over a cliff edge at any point. And I mean, a key thing at the moment is how this first shipment of 200 tons gets on, getting to its port or whatever they're able to build tomorrow. It will then have to go through checks by the Israeli military, so there's no particular reason for thinking it's going to be easy at that point, or that there won't be further holdups. And then there's the problem of how it's going to be distributed. And it's just a drop in the ocean. What we actually need is a ceasefire now, and the beginnings of a negotiated settlement that will be in the end to everybody's benefit. I know that sounds like pie in the sky at the moment because of where we are, but it really is what we need right now, because whatever we do to put in aid in there is not going to be enough, because the situation is already out of control, and you're looking at a desperate people basically being starved. And the spokespeople of the UN and others are quite right. It's a man-made catastrophe, and therefore it needs to be fixed by us. And let's hope that there's more progress on that in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you, William. For our next story, we're shifting our focus back to the UK, where the Speaker of the House fails to let Diane Abbott respond to Tory donors' comments on PMQs. The Commons Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, has sparked a fresh row by refusing to allow Diane Abbott to ask a question during a heated session of Prime Minister's questions, which was dominated by a discussion of a Conservative donor's comments about her. Abbott had sought to ask a question throughout the 35-minute session, during which MPs debated the comments made about her by Frank Hester, the Conservatives' biggest donor. Earlier this week, it was reported that Hester once said Abbott made him want to hate all black women, quote, and that she should be shot. Comments VMP has called frightening. Hoyle provoked groans in the chamber, however, by ending the session without having called on her, even after the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, and Stephen Flynn, the Scottish National Party leader in Westminster, both used their questions to raise the controversy. Hoyle is already under fire over his decision last month to allow the Labour Party to amend an SNP motion on Gaza, a decision which triggered anger on the SNP benches and prompted an unprecedented apology from the Speaker himself. Abbott tweeted afterwards, "I don't know whose interests the Speaker thinks he is serving, but it is not the interests of the Commons or democracy." As Prime Minister's questions finished, Stephen Flynn and Starmer approached Abbott to talk to her as she sat on the back benches. According to an account of a conversation retweeted by Abbott herself, Starmer asked if there was anything he could do to help her, to which she replied, "Restore the whip." Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak is facing growing calls to return the £10 million donated to the Conservative Party by Frank Hester. William, do you think this was general oversight by the Speaker, or what exactly happened here? Do you have any assumptions or any thoughts, William?
I wish I could see into the mind of the Speaker right now, because he seems to be doing an awful lot of things that just don't fit the situation. Diane Abbott's just gone through the quite surreal experience of being spoken about by more than one party leader at Westminster during Prime Minister's questions, and wanting to, if you like, intervene on her own behalf and getting no chance to do so. So she's been effectively silenced in this particular chamber at this particular time. And the Speaker is not. It's not his job to be silencing people, although he seems to be doing it more and more. I should think that will only add to the number of calls for him to resign, which at the moment he doesn't show any great sign of doing. But I do think that his re-election might be a question mark after the general election, should that be the case. So Diane Abbott is quite right to be saying what she's saying about this whole discussion, because it's been focused on racism. Well, it certainly is racist, although it's one of those racist remarks that's always sort of talked around, saying, well, I'm not a racist, but it's clearly a racist remark. There's no doubt about that. But the other word that's being used by particularly Tory parliamentarians is that it's rude. Well, it's a damn sight more than rude. It's hate speech. Whether it was in jest or whether it's not, he called for her to be shot. And, that is just beyond the pale. And it's undoubtedly hate speech. And it's a matter, certainly of morality, but also practicality for the Tories to not accept the £10 million, or at least to find a use for it that maybe helps the cause of tackling racism within the party, because it's bad.
Thank you. Also, to clear a little bit of confusion for me, what exactly is the implication here of Diane Abbott telling Keir Starmer to restore the whip? How does that does that have specific reference to the situation?
Yeah, the whip was withdrawn from Diane Abbott some months ago,
right,
because she made a statement comparing anti-Semitism and how black people were treated, which she subsequently almost immediately withdrew. I think it was a somewhat ill-advised statement, but she did withdraw it very quickly. But she remains, quote, under investigation after, I think it's something like 11 months when I think about it. And so she is currently without the whip, and that might, of course, be why technically the Speaker didn't want to call her, in case that was in some way embarrassing for Labour. But that's why she was saying restore the whip. But she didn't seem to be getting any change out of Starmer for that.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you for clearing that up for me. For our next story, we have the UK government to introduce a bill to quash convictions of Horizon scandal victims in England and Wales. UK government ministers have introduced legislation to quash the convictions of hundreds of post office operators who were prosecuted during the Horizon scandal in a move described as an exceptional response to a factually exceptional situation. The government introduced a bill in Parliament on Wednesday afternoon that will exonerate victims of a scandal in England and Wales, but exclude Scotland and Northern Ireland. The bill, which is unprecedented in its nature, will overturn convictions of theft, fraud, false accounting, money laundering, and linked offences that are handed down in connection with post office businesses over more than a decade. It will cover prosecutions brought by the Post Office and the Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales between the 23rd of September 1996 and the 31st of December 2018. Convictions will be quashed automatically once the bill becomes law, vindicating hundreds of victims who have campaigned for years in what has been described as the largest miscarriage of justice in UK history. There have been more than 900 convictions linked to the scandal, which involved post office operators being falsely prosecuted after a faulty computer system, Horizon, made it look as if money was missing. Only about 100 of these convictions have been quashed through the court system so far. Scottish Government Justice Secretary Angela Constance responded to the announcement that the UK government legislation will only apply to England and Wales. Ms. Constance said, "We, along with Northern Ireland Executive, urged the UK government to introduce UK-wide legislation as the best way to ensure there is quick, fair, and equal solution for all affected sub-postmasters, particularly as the post office is reserved to Westminster. So this announcement is extremely disappointing. It is not too late for the UK government to change their position, but if this continues to be refused, we will introduce Scottish legislation that delivers justice for all those affected. It is likely that this would need to be passed after the UK bill is passed to ensure full compatibility with UK legislation and the UK compensation scheme, in which the Scottish government has no locus. But we will do everything in our power to work as quickly as possible." I suppose the first question on the agenda, William, is why can't the initial legislation cover Northern Ireland and Scotland?
I don't see any reason why it can't. It's down to Westminster to work the legislation so that it does cover both places, and they haven't done so. And this is not atypical of the Westminster government. There have been frequent occasions in which they seem to have drafted legislation so as to inconvenience Scotland and sometimes Wales, and in this case Northern Ireland, almost willfully. I cannot understand, bearing in mind how serious a thing this is that's now gone on for years with people's lives ruined, why there has to be yet another hurdle when there doesn't need to be. But undoubtedly, the Scottish Government, if nothing is done to resolve this, will introduce its own legislation, but it will mean further delays, and that, of course, will be reflected in the political climate up here, which is going to be very, very tiresome. And it's particularly tiresome for the postmasters and sub-postmasters themselves, who are already showing signs of despairing about anything other than talking ever happening. I mean, this looks like a fairly good package, but it's not watertight, because there will be some people who aren't adequately recompensed by it. What it needs to do, though, absolutely as a priority, is to absolutely get rid of any sense that these people were guilty of anything when they were absolutely wronged. I'm using the word absolutely quite a lot. I must stop. They were wronged by the justice system. So that is definitely the priority.
Um, Taking a look at it from a different angle, is it possible that it could have been some rightful convictions amongst this as well that will now get sort of like this blanket in release?
It's theoretically possible, yes. But if there were rightful convictions to be made, the prosecuting authority, which in England and Wales is the Post Office, needs to provide evidence that will result in the conviction of the sub-postmasters involved. Their current convictions are going to be deemed unsafe in law, and that is the correct thing. My feeling is that there's probably a vanishingly small number of cases where people might have been guilty of anything, because the overwhelming evidence is that this is a horrific information technology disaster rather than criminality.
Thank you. In our next story, the SNP vote against the UK budget cuts to public services. The SNP have accused the Tory and Labour parties of condemning Scotland's public services to another decade of Westminster austerity cuts, end quote, after the latest stage of Tory budget was passed this evening. Drew Hendry MP has warned both the Tories and Labour that they are for having created a conspiracy of silence over the devastating impact these cuts will have, and that both parties must come clean on where Westminster acts will fall on public services. The SNP tabled a reasoned amendment to the National Contributions Bill, which aimed to reject the UK government's plan to cuts to public sector investment, which the IFS warned implies a real terms cut to net public sector investment of £18 billion between 2024 and 25, and 28 and to 29, and up to £25 billion on a spending per person basis. That would be a real terms £25 billion cut on a spending per person basis. That amendment was rejected by the Tories, with Labour adhering to the Bain principle and abstaining on an SNP amendment. Commenting, the SNP's economy spokesperson, Drew Hendry MP, said, "Tonight the Tories and Labour passed a bill that will condemn Scotland's public services to another decade of austerity cuts. Both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer have created a conspiracy of silence over the devastating impact these cuts will have on public services like our NHS. They must now come clean as to where the Westminster Acts will fall when it comes to public service cuts." In contrast, the SNP put forward an amendment which would have rejected these brutal cuts, an amendment the Labour Party cowardly abstained from. William, just dropped my pencil. Don't need it right now, I suppose. The Conservatives would argue that these cuts are necessary so that they can cut taxes, for example, and draw more growth for the country. Do you see it this way as well?
I don't necessarily think that tax cuts will lead to growth, certainly not as quickly as would be necessary to offset the problems that are caused by cuts to public spending. Growth comes from more money circulating in the economy. Right now, ordinary people aren't able to spend to anything like the extent that would be necessary to produce real growth because of the cost of living crisis and the high price of energy, etc. And if the people don't spend, then the government has to spend. Otherwise, the economy runs into the sand. So I don't buy the underlying idea that that public spending cuts are absolutely necessary. We need to be investing in the economy now, and it's government that's got to do it. And if that does mean more debt or more printing money for a short period of time, then so be it. Because the effect of doing that, of spending that money, will be perhaps to rescue the economy from the perilous state it's in, and in particular to rescue public services, which are, by common consent, in an absolutely dire state. They're in a dire state in England for sure, where local authorities are looking like going bust willy-nilly, but they're almost as bad, although not quite as bad, I would surmise, in Scotland. And you can see the problems mounting up every day, and that needs to be fixed. And handing out more money to people who are already reasonably well off is not going to cut it. So I don't buy the argument at all.
Thank you. A Green MP calls for UK government to address gambling-related harm. Inverclyde MP Ronnie Cohen has led a debate in Westminster Hall today, highlighting the harms of gambling advertising in sport and the need for urgent UK government intervention. Ronnie Cowan is the vice chair of the APPG on gambling-related harm, and he raised the growing issue of children gambling, and pushed for recognition of gambling as a health issue. It is estimated that 80,000 UK children are addicted or at risk of gambling, on top of up to 1.4 million UK adults who are harmed directly by gambling. In total, 20% of the UK population is harmed directly or indirectly by gambling-related harm. Commenting, Ronnie Cowan MP said, "The UK government must finally step up and address the growing issue of gambling advertising in sport. Implementing urgent reforms to tackle the growing problem of child gambling and developing a comprehensive strategy across UK government departments is the least the Tories should be doing. The UK government must listen to cross-party MPs as well as organisations such as Gambling with Lives and the Testimony of Gambling Addicts, who are calling for the reform of regulation and further support for those affected. We must act now." Quote, probably from, that's the end quote of the, sorry, that's the end of a quote from the MP, my bad. So, William, the story obviously mentions children gambling. How do children gamble? How does that happen?
I imagine that the children that gamble. The answer is I don't absolutely know how they do it, but I suspect they're quite close to the age where you can gamble, but not quite over it, and
Mm.
they lie about their age, and they'll get dragged into it also by some parents, etc. And there may also be gaming side to it, because the online is a pretty unregulated area. But you're not speaking to an expert here, and I have to say, quite surprised by the number of children cited in what Ronnie Cowan was saying.
To be fair, it was gambling or at risk of gambling. But yeah, I suppose like the internet poses a big issue here, and then there's the
Yeah,
overlap with certain video games allowing for gambling related things, which can also cause trouble. But yeah, I think we're
yeah,
good to head over to the next story. So, a report finds failure to insulate UK homes costing thousands of lives a year. The UK government's failure to invest in insulating the UK's cold and leaky homes is costing thousands of lives a year, according to analysis. The report from Greenpeace reveals 58 people have died due to cold homes every day on average during the winter since David Cameron's Conservative government decided to, quote, cut the green crap in 2013, drastically slashing support for home insulation. Paul Morozzo, a Greenpeace UK's fuel poverty campaigner, said thousands of people are literally freezing to death in their own homes during winter. And not only have successive UK governments failed to prevent this needless and shocking loss of life, but they have fueled this silent public health crisis by slashing insulation funding and failing to deliver a proper scheme to upgrade our cold, damp, draughty homes. Morozzo said tackling cold and damp homes would not only save lives, but would reduce bills, tackling fuel poverty and the cost of living crisis, as well as reducing carbon emissions. Activists pointed out that the UK had some of the least energy efficient housing in Western Europe. UK government figures released last month show there are 3.17 million households living in fuel poverty in the UK. Poorly insulated homes also contribute to poor health and are estimated to cost the NHS more than £850 million a year in England. Housing is directly responsible for about 14% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions, driven in part by the large proportion of uninsulated or poorly insulated homes. In last week's budget, the Chancellor cut funding for investment in building new homes, resulting in cuts in England and in devolved governments through reduced Barnett consequentials. William, how important is the insulation of homes? Is this like a very cost-effective, useful thing that we need as many homes as possible to have?
I think it's a pretty effective way of both cutting costs long term, and also, of course, it's quite important in actual energy usage and for the green revolution. So there are both sides to it. So yes, it's very important, but the upfront cost, bearing in mind the poorly insulated state of many of the UK's homes, and as you said, we're amongst the least well off in this regard in Western Europe. The upfront cost is something that really needs to be um, provided to a certain extent by government, because people just do not have the money to do it, and that's the problem. And then when you set this off against the anticipated cuts in public spending that we were talking about just previously, it's hard to see where this money is coming from. It certainly doesn't seem to be coming from an incoming Labour government, because they have cut back on their own commitments to the green revolution, including the cost of insulation. Um, Insulation could also become more important, just as climate change actually takes hold, and that's, I think, something we're going to be talking about. So it's really in the centre of everything. It's one of those things, and there are so many of them, that it it can't just fall on individuals because the burden is too great. There are too many things happening at once, and there needs to be some central intervention to fix that and to take us forward so that everybody benefits, because the current situation, in my view, is unsustainable.
Do you know of anything else in the UK that could be contributing to making us the least energy effective homes?
Um, I would I would suggest it might be the way we've been building houses when we've been building houses for the last wee while. I mean, I think some private houses, privately built houses, not that's to say affordable houses that are built are just fine for insulation, thank you very much. But some of the older buildings were never well insulated, and you know, maybe we got away with it to a certain extent, but that has got to change for sure.
Thank you. For our next story, like you predicted, we are moving on to a climate change topic with a committee on climate change saying that the UK government has no credible plan for effects of extreme weather. The UK's plan for adapting to the effects of a climate crisis fall far short of what is required, the government's statutory advisor has said. The Climate Change Committee, CCC, has examined the National Adaptation Programme published by UK ministers last July, intended to set out how people, buildings, and vital national infrastructure such as water, transport, energy, and telecommunications networks could be protected from the increased severity of storms, floods, heat waves, and droughts that are afflicting the UK as a result of global heating. In a damning verdict delivered today, the committee found that the UK government had no credible plan for making the UK resilient to the increasing effects of extreme weather. Julia King, chair of the Adaptation Subcommittee of the CCC, said, "The evidence of the damage from climate change has never been clearer, but the UK's current approach to adaptation is not working." The National Adaptation Plan, published last July, known as NAP3, was the third in a series of 5 yearly updates in response to an assessment of climate risks required under the 2008 Climate Change Act from the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. But the CCC found that although it was an improvement on previous efforts, the new plan was still inadequate and required improvements before the next schedule update in 2028. The CCC found that most of NAP3 was based on existing policy or mechanisms which were inadequate and ignored more than half of the short-term actions to address urgent risks from extreme weather that had been identified in the latest risk assessment. The report sharply criticized DEFRA for failing to make adaptation a priority and to work closely with other government departments on the issue. Ministers had also failed to fund adaptation efforts sufficiently or provide the incentives for private sector investment the CCC found, and there was too little monitoring and evaluation. Last month was the hottest February ever recorded globally, and in the UK it was the fourth wettest. Heavy rain is making it difficult for farmers to get crops in the ground, while crop pollination may also suffer as the mild February brought bees early from their winter sleeps, only to famish as few blooms were ready. William, you might have experienced it yourself. The storms specifically have been getting heavier. They've been getting wetter. They were getting more frequent. We had a pretty rough couple of months, and this had tremendous effects on our farming economy. What would you like to see in like who would you like to step up and sort of take charge in adapting to these climate events?
Well, again, this is something where large amounts of public spending are required that don't seem to have been provided. Now, that um, let me correct that slightly. The government keeps telling us what they've spent, and this is what governments always do. We've spent so much on X, Y, and Z. But what there doesn't seem to be is a proper plan, and that's really what the committee here is talking about. So if you spend money, you really have to do it effectively, and you have to look at what's actually happening now, which you can see, in the knowledge that it will probably get worse, because I think it is steadily now getting worse, particularly in the winter time. And the shocker for me was that NAP3, the latest set of plans, where it did provide an improvement, but it didn't address over half the problems that had been identified in the most recent analysis. So this is currently a half-baked plan that isn't really enough to do the job. So I think we need to be a lot more serious, not just about preventing future climate change. That ship may or may not have sailed, but recognizing that it's a problem right now with the effects of the weather, some quite unpredictable ones, to be fair, but other things that are predictable. So we're talking in terms of better flood barriers, because the once in a 200 year is no longer once in a 200 year. We need to be looking at how we strengthen homes against increased wind speeds, and how we secure things like power supplies against hurricanes or near hurricanes that we may get increasingly in years to come. And just basic resilience of public services in the face of disruption, because there has been a lot of disruption in recent months. October, I recall, was a particularly bad month in our parts for flooding and other things, but we've also had some fairly strong winds as well, and this will go on getting worse. And we need to be stepping up to the plate. Government needs to be stepping up to the plate and making the investment in the right places that's needed. Again, you've got to view it against statements that are made about public spending cuts. Now is not the time for those.
Thank you. We're shifting our focus over to America, where a group of former Trump supporters campaigned to vote against him. An anti-Donald Trump group of Republicans is launching its second campaign against the former president, spending $50 million and using testimonials from former supporters in an attempt to convince voters to turn away from Trump. This week, Republican voters against Trump released 100 videos recorded by anti-Trump Republicans explaining why they no longer support him. Sarah Longwell, president of Republican Accountability Political Actions Committee, which is behind the campaign, explained the logic behind the effort in a press release on Tuesday. Traditional Republican voters have long supported the party, but have concerns about Donald Trump sorry. I'm going to start that quote again. So this is from the press release of the committee that's launching the campaign against him. Traditional Republican voters who have long supported the party but have concerns about Donald Trump proved decisive in the 2020 election. By targeting these voters and reaching them with credible messengers, the campaign will establish a permission structure for them to withhold their support from Trump again, she said. Continuing the quote, this will help recreate the anti-Trump coalition that made the margin of victory in 2020 and holds the key to 2024. The group ran the same unconventional ad campaign against Trump in 2020, when it ultimately received over 1,000 homemade testimonials on its website. In many of the videos, former supporters say that the January 6th Capitol insurrection turned them against Trump. Many other supporters similarly expressed disbelief at Trump's popularity with the Republican Party, often saying that Biden is the first Democrat they have ever supported. Longwell said in a release this week that she believed former Republicans and Republican-leaning voters hold the key to 2024. William, I suppose the question to you is, how effective can this campaign really be? I mean, the people commenting within the story themselves say that the insurrection of Capitol 6 was the turning point for them. For people that still hold Trump in a high regard after January 6th, will a campaign like this ever reach them?
It won't reach all of them, no. But the Republican Voters Against Trump group will argue that it was their campaign that was instrumental in changing the minds of enough Republicans in 2020 for Trump not to win the election. And then if you add to it that some of the people who did vote for Trump undoubtedly will have been shaken by the 6th of January insurrection, then maybe they have some fertile ground that they can work on. And it's about breaking people away from what they've been doing for a long time, which is voting Republican, to, if you like, lending their votes perhaps to Joe Biden. And it's very interesting, the terminology they use. And I think we can benefit in the campaigns like Scottish Independence Campaign on this, for establishing a permission structure for you to do something that you wouldn't otherwise have been totally comfortable with. Just setting up a load of facts and impressions that will just sway you enough not to support this particular candidate. So I think there is hope for it. I think it's a reasonable initiative to be undertaking. Whether it works in the current climate in America is a question mark, because of course the other side of the coin is how the Biden presidency has gone, or rather is perceived as having gone. And Biden is not a popular president, although I think probably he isn't getting all the credit he deserves. So there are those two sides of the coin, and we'll just have to see how the campaign pans out. But there are a significant number, I think it's something like 40% of Americans are not attached either to the Republican or the Democratic Party. And I'm sure a lot of them will be interested to hear why Republicans are changing, and they won't be tempted to try the Trump Kool-Aid one other time. But America is a very difficult place to predict, and every time I make a prediction about it, I'm wrong. So I'm not going to do that. But we shall see.
I think you make a good point there, where a lot of these swing voters it can be a pretty damning thing to hear about somebody switching sides and what convinced them to do so. So thank you for that. Thank you for the statement. For our next story, back to Scotland, where Public Health Scotland is increasing support to help people stop smoking. Stopping smoking increases your chances of living a longer and healthier life, and Quit Your Way Scotland increases your chances of stopping smoking and staying stopped. That's the message from Public Health Scotland (PHS) this No Smoking Day to anyone in Scotland who wants to give up smoking, even if you have tried to quit before. It comes during a refreshed marketing campaign to inform people about the free NHS Stop Smoking service and the different ways that people can access support. The national campaign targets adults across Scotland aged 35 to 64 who smoke, which is around 730,000 people, or 11% of Scotland's total population. With radio and digital advertising, along with posters in healthcare and community settings, it aims to encourage greater use of Quit Your Way to help ensure that smoking rates continue to go down. Dr. Garth Reid, a consultant on public health at PHS, said, "Smoking remains one of the biggest causes of ill health and premature death in Scotland, and results in more than 8,000 deaths per year. People who smoke are likely to experience a range of health conditions associated with smoking, including poor mental health. These risks substantially fall with stopping smoking, and the health benefits start to happen quickly, even for people who have smoked for a long time. Quit Your Way can help anyone trying to stop smoking in Scotland whenever they are ready. It's always a good time to quit." William, do you know anybody yourself that has quit smoking? And if so, what has helped them on that journey? What is it that pushed them over the edge?
I think in some cases switching to vaping might have helped. I don't actually know all that many smokers, although not all that many that'll admit to it in any case. But I think nicotine addiction is an addiction, and it's difficult to understate, or rather to overstate, how difficult it is to stop. And there's two sides to it. The first is, particularly for people who have tried and failed to quit smoking and have wanted to but weren't able to sustain it, the confidence to take the first step again, because it would seem that just repeating something that didn't work before, but also once they've got the confidence, been given the confidence by the Quit Your Way program, the support that they need. And that can be personalized support, because it might be a different experience for everybody. And this sounds to me like a great initiative. If it's got the resources to deliver everything it says, starting from the principle that people are actually going to want to quit smoking, and then just giving them, first of all, the nudge they need to make the commitment, and then to be able to sustain them in that commitment through some of the days that will really be quite difficult. But hats off to them, and let's hope that it is a success this year, as I suspect it has been in other years, because 11% isn't bad compared to the percentages that used to be common in society in Scotland and elsewhere.
Thank you. And for our last story of the day, cancer sciences in Glasgow contributed more than £500 million in a year to the UK economy. A new report has hailed the strength of patient-centred cancer science in the west of Scotland, estimating that cancer research in Glasgow was worth more than £500 million, £503 million specifically. to the UK economy in 2021 to 22. This economic impact is a direct result of the unique and integrated life sciences ecosystem that has been created in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, led by the University of Glasgow working in collaboration with the NHS, industry, patient groups, government, and funders. Written by London Economics, one of Europe's leading specialist economics and policy consultancies, the comprehensive report captures the economic impact of a combined cancer research power of the University of Glasgow School of Cancer Sciences and the CRUK Beatson Institute, now the CRUK Scotland Institute. Working in close collaboration with each other, these two bodies constitute the core cancer research institutions in the west of Scotland, providing world-leading academic and clinical expertise. Of the estimated £503 million of economic impact cancer sciences, £503 million of economic impact for cancer sciences in Glasgow generated, £407 million, 81%, was associated with the impact of the institution's combined research activities. £77 million, 15%, came from operating and capital spending, and £19 million, 4%, was attributable to the economic contributions of the institution's teaching and learning activities. In addition, experts assess that for every £1 million of research income received, the combined power of research activities of the two institutions generated a total of £10.2 million in economic impact across the UK. The report, which focuses on cancer research activity from 21 to 22, does not include the additional economic impact of a recent £123 million 7-year investment by Cancer Research UK into the CRUK Scotland Institute, which is facilitated in partnership with the University of Glasgow at its Garscube campus. Announced in September 2023, the funding, which is Cancer Research UK's largest ever investment in Scotland, followed a separate and comprehensive review led by an independent panel of international cancer experts. Let's just read that again for clarity, since we have time. Announced in September 2023, the funding, which is Cancer Research UK's largest ever investment in Scotland, followed a separate and comprehensive review led by an independent panel of international cancer experts. Scotland experiences higher rates of cancer incidence and mortality than the rest of the UK, with disease burden particularly high in Glasgow and Greater Glasgow at more than 700 cases per 100,000 residents. Glasgow is also home to the largest cancer centre in Scotland, the Beatson West of Scotland Cancer Centre, which sees more than 8,500 new patients and over 60,000 turn patients every year. These factors have inspired the creation of a unique ecosystem approach to cancer research in Glasgow and the West, where university researchers work in close partnership with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, the NHS GG&C. Industry, funders, and patient groups on world-leading clinical trials and healthcare innovation. I'm just going to read that one more time. Where university researchers work in close partnership with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and the industry and also funders and patient groups on world-leading clinical trials and healthcare innovations. William, I suppose this matches up to the point that you made earlier, where public investment can actually stir growth and money and GDP and money flow in an economy. Is that what you take from the story?
That's one of the things I take from the story. It's important to invest, but to invest sensibly in something that works. And what this is a partnership operation, it seems. Technically, it's known, I believe, as the triple helix approach, which is, according to Wikipedia, if you look it up, a set of interactions between academia, there's the universities for you, industry, and government. And all of them are important, separate strands, but they work together to produce a good result. And I think that what this is doing is pretty world leading from the sound of it, and it needs to be, because we have a problem here to be solved. And yes, the investment has a spin-off multiplier effect, and that's very good on the economy, but hopefully also it has the outcomes that you need to actually change the situation in a more permanent way. The 123 million over 7 years that's going into CRUK is way ahead of the figures we're hearing here, of course, because they're actually quite a long time ago, 2021, 22, and a lot has happened since then. So I'll be looking with interest to see how comparable news reports are maybe in 2 or 3 years' time. Let's hope that there's a significant improvement and a lot achieved.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much for that contribution. The triple helix added to my repertoire of terms and words. All thanks to you, William. And with that, I will also thank you for joining me today. William Duguid, writer and worker at Perfinkin Ross for the Yes campaign. Is that correct?
Thank you. Yes, it's been great.
Fantastic. Well, that is it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. Thank you again to our guests for joining us, and goodbye, and thank you.